All right, everyone, what we're going to cover today in this short lecture is a continuation of neurology, but what we need to discuss is this concept of dermatomes, myotomes, and reflexes. So let me do a screen share here with you. All right, so what we're looking at here are dermatomes, and we're going to look at the dermatomes of levels C5, C6, C7, C8, and T1, which is the brachial plexus up on top. And when we check dermatomes, we use something called a Wartenberg's pinwheel, which looks like this. It has a very kind of sharp, you can see like this. And if you've ever been to a doctor, we would glide this down and say, can you feel this? And we would compare it to the other side. Does it feel like this? And we do this bilateral comparison. So when we're checking the C5 dermatome, we're checking the upper arm. That's C5. When we check the C6, it's the 6-shooter, these two fingers. When we check C7, it's the birdie. When we check C8, it's the last 2 digits to mid forearm. When we check T1, we simply lie down our hand here, that's T1, and then T2 is PU under the armpit. Those are dermatomes. You can have any type of abnormal sensation. Some people say pins and needles. Paresthesia just means abnormal sensation. Someone can have the lack of sensation on one side and more sensation on the other side. So when we do a comparison, let's say, I would say, do you feel this? And I go, yeah. Does it feel like this? And I say, no. Okay. Does this feel more or less than this? Well, this feels less. Well, maybe it's hypoesthesia on my right C6 dermatome, or maybe it's more sensation on this side. So what would I have to do? I would have to compare the C6 dermatome to C7 and to the C5. I have to go above and below and compare. So if I say, does this feel like this? And I say yes. Does this on the middle digit feel like this? And I say yes. Now I know that these are normal. Maybe this side is abnormal and it's too much sensation. Does that make sense? Okay, so those are the dermatomes. Now, myotomes, myo for muscle. If I want to check the myotome for C5, we check abduction for the middle delts, and we check the biceps. Those are both for C5. If we want to check C6, there's a little bit of overlap. C6 also gets the biceps, and it also gets the wrist extensors. So you'd have them extend the wrist, you give some resistance, and if it's strong, it's good. If it's weak, then there's a C6 nerve root issue in the neck. When we do C7, that makes the number 7. So it is elbow extension for the triceps, wrist flexion for the wrist flexors, and finger extension for the finger extensor. So it's those 3 actions that you would muscle test: elbow extension, wrist flexion, and finger extension. For C8, it is finger flexors primarily, and then the adductors and abductors, but mostly finger flexors for C8. And then for T1, that's isolating just the adductors and abductors of the fingers. So let me give you a scenario. So I have a patient that comes in. The patient had some sort of neck trauma or whiplash, and now they have a stiff neck. They can't move, but they also have paresthesia to these two fingers. They say their fingers are numb. Okay, so maybe I think there's a dermatome issue. I can check, if I think this is C6, I can then check the wrist extensors. But there's something else I can check that could also verify the severity of it, and that is reflexes. Let me see if I can find my reflex hammer. I thought I may have it nearby, and I do. 1 second. Okay, so here is the reflex hammer, a type of reflex hammer, and I can tap it over the brachioradialis, which is for C6. If I bring this up, I can then see if I want to check for C5 reflex, that's isolating the bicep reflex. If I want to check for the C6 nerve root, I can check the brachioradialis reflex. If I want to check C7, I tap over here for the tricep reflex, and that's for the upper extremity. For the lower, if I tap over the patella and I get the knee jerk reflex, that would be for L4. And if I tap over the Achilles tendon, as we are doing here, that's for S1. So the biceps is for C5, the brachioradialis is for C6, the triceps is for C7, the patella reflex here is for L4, and the Achilles reflex is for S1. Don't worry about the plantar reflex. So now let's put it all together. Now we have a person who was in neck trauma. They had some whiplash, and these two fingers are numb and tingly. So if these are numb and tingly, I can go, well, that's the C6 dermatome. Is there a myotome? Yes, I could check wrist extensors. Is there a reflex? Yes, I can check the brachioradialis reflex. Now, if all three of those are weak or affected, we can say the neurological package for C6 is affected. There's hypoesthesia, lack of sensation to the C6 dermatome. There is weakness to the wrist extensors, and the bicep reflex is almost non-existent. Okay, or we could look at the lumbar package, right? We know that L1, L2, and 3, if you look at the dermatomes, not on this one, but on the PowerPoint, you'll see L1, L2, and L3 are in the upper thigh. L4 is the inner shin down to the big toe on the inside. So if they have numbness to the great toe, but more on the inside of the great toe, and they have weakness to the dorsiflexor, because L4 is the dorsiflexor, and then I tap over the patella reflex, and that's not existent. Now they have L4 dermatome, L4 myotome, which is weak dorsiflexor of the foot, and they have no patella reflex. L4 in the lower back is the problem. For L5, it's more of the front of the shin and the top of the foot to all the toes. That's the L5 dermatome. But if they can't do toe jive for L5, if they can't extend the toes, and that's weak, and the dermatome to the top of the foot is shot, then there's an issue. L5 is also hip abduction. So leg to the side and toe jive is L5 for the myotome. For S1, it's plantar flexion and hip extension. So stepping on the tippy toes and extending the hip for gluteus maximus. If S1 nerve root is affected, then that myotome, those muscles will be weak. Okay, and S1 is the bottom of the sole of the foot, and it's the outer, it's almost like the mirror image to L4, which is the inner great toe. It's the outer pinky toe. Okay, and S1 has the Achilles tendon reflex. So there isn't a reflex for every single nerve root level. In the lower back, there's only a reflex for L4 and S1. Okay, but there is a myotome for L4, L5, and S1. There's dermatomes for them, there's myotomes, there's just not a reflex for each level. And you'll see the same thing for the upper is that, well, there's no reflex for C7. I'm sorry, there's no reflex for C8 and T1 because here, biceps is C5, brachioradialis is C6, triceps is C7. What about C8 and T1? There is no reflex. But they do have myotomes. If we look up here, C8 and T1 do have muscles that are controlled by these nerve roots. Okay? Okay, so there's a little background to dermatomes and myotomes. If someone has a sensory issue, it's challenging to fix, but fixable. If that's the only thing, it's more manageable. If they have a dermatome affected and a myotome, like a weak muscle, then it becomes a little bit more challenging, but still fixable. Once it goes to the reflex and the reflex becomes very, very weak, it means it's much more serious. What do I mean by serious? It means that they probably have a little bit more of a disc herniation that's going on. In many instances, they can have a healthy 2 vertebrae with a disc, and you see the nerve root here. But when this kind of misaligns, you can see the nerve root gets pinched. That can create paresthesia or even muscle weakness. The more severe the nerve root compression by the disc or the misalignment, then the more serious it is. And we can have disc compressions that have different severities. So if I show you this, this is healthy. Then you look here, it starts to get a little bit more compressed. Then here, there's more compression and a lot of bone decay. And here it's even worse. And if we look at it from the side, if we look at this vertebra, which is nice and healthy in terms of the nerve root here, and then we compare it to here, there's a little bit more compression. Here it's healthy. Here it's being a little bit compressed. But if we compare it to this one here, now you can see the nerve root is really being choked. And in this one, more so. So the more pinching of that subluxation, the more irritation, the more serious the dermatome, myotome, and the reflexes become diminished. In this case, healthy nerve root. In this case, subluxation, you're really being pinched here. If it's here, it's still manageable because even if this gets tractioned or we open this up a little bit, it gives some breathing space for that nerve root. Okay. What else can I one of the other things that I check for seriousness or subluxation or nerve impingement, we use something called a dynamometer, which is a meter, and they can grab this, and then as you can see, let me bring this out a little bit, if I squeeze, you can see the needle moving, and then if I let go, it saves it. So if I reset this and I grab this, I hold my arm at 90 degrees and I squeeze, squeeze, squeeze. Then I look and I can go, okay, there was 140 pounds of strength. Then I compare it to my other side, right? Then I hold it 90 degrees, I squeeze, squeeze, squeeze. Then I compare, and that's exactly 140 degrees as well. And then you could see, you simply turn it and it resets. So wherever I move the needle and I let go, it holds it there. Okay. The problem lies if the person squeezes with the right hand and gets 140, they squeeze on the left and they get 100. Now there's a 40-pound difference. Now there's pinching of the nerve on the left side. They have another dynamometer that goes beyond finger strength, and it just checks pincer strength. So I can grab this and I can squeeze it with just these two fingers. And then I look and I go, okay, 10 pounds of crushing force. If I compare it to my left and I squeeze and I look, also symmetrical, 10 pounds of crushing force. Then you can hold it instead of this way, like a credit card. Then you can pinch this way. And that one has about 22 pounds of crushing force. Again, we check symmetry. I can hold like a credit card here. I squeeze, and again, I'm looking for symmetry and its exact match of about 22 or 23 pounds of crushing force with just these two fingers. Again, if this one said 23, but this one said 10, then I'd say there's nerve interference or subluxation, a nerve blockage in the neck. And then we can make an adjustment or treat it, and then reevaluate the hand strength to see if the nerve irritation was removed. Okay, pretty neat. Same thing with the reflexes. Same thing with the dermatomes. After the treatment, we would reevaluate and try and bring out symmetry and balance to that. Okay, all right, so I hope you found that helpful. Let me stop the screen share here.